Hey, Blondeguygamer here. Now, unless you never played a video game before, chances are you played a sequel to one. It's almost inevitable that popular and successful games will get a sequel, but what about the more obscure ones? Sequels of games that people may not realize existed or even expected to follow up. Well, that's what I'm going to showcase in this new review series of games that make people go, "They made a sequel?" Let's start off with the sequel of the NES racing game Rad Racer with Rad Racer 2 and see how they compare. And yeah, you couldn't get any more 80s than Rad in the title. In 1996, Sega released Outrun in arcades. The goal of it was simple: race to the end before time ran out that you can extend by reaching checkpoints along alternating routes. If you're wondering why I'm talking about this game instead of the actual Rad Racer games, it's because the first Rad Racer came out a year later, obviously inspired by Outrun, what with it having similar cars, gameplay, and sprite scaling to give it a 3D effect. However, there are some differences in Rad Racer to not just be an Outrun clone, and it holds up well enough on its own. It also rightfully has its place in game culture, even being the game that Lucas played with the Power Glove in The Wizard.
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
The game was made by Square, a fact that still amuses people that they made games like this before Final Fantasy, which was released in Japan shortly after Rad Racer. The goal of the game was also simple: get to the end before time runs out, which you can extend by passing through checkpoints as well, all the while driving through winding turns and avoiding other cars. The differences with this and Outrun though is that instead of one big stage with alternating routes, Rad Racer has 8 locations to drive through. Another is when time runs out, you can still coast your way through checkpoints and finish lines if you had enough speed and were close enough. There is also being able to choose between a 328 Twin Turbo and a Formula 1 machine, although there is no difference between how the cars drive and is just a cosmetic choice for what you and the traffic will be driving. Finally, there is a 3D mode you can activate with the select button. It's supposed to give a 3D effect with red and blue glasses similar to Square's earlier game, 3D World Runner, but I can safely say it doesn't really work, and believe me, I actually did try and play this with 3D glasses. Yep, we've certainly come a long way in 3D technology, going from red and blue glasses that sometimes work to 3D TVs and the Nintendo 3DS. This is about as fun as it looks, by the way. Though the Famicom version of Rad Racer, which was called Highway Star, actually used an accessory called the Famicom 3D system that works similarly to the Sega Master System 3D glasses, the latter even ironically having a 3D version of Outrun 2 years after Rad Racer. Despite the 3D gimmick, Rad Racer is still a fun game to play. It has tight controls, intense fast-paced challenge, and for a 1987 NES game, looks pretty impressive. So naturally, with the success of a solid racing game on the NES, a sequel was to follow. 3 years later in 1990. And only in North America. Well, the latter could be due to the fact Rad Racer was more popular here, but still, why 3 years? That's a while for an NES sequel back then. Was Square too busy making more Final Fantasy games or something? But even so, you would think that since it took that long for Rad Racer 2 to come out, that it would be better. But no, it isn't. In fact, it just feels like a rehashed and inferior version of Rad Racer. For starters, you can only drive the 328. Though that isn't really a big deal since most people use that car and there wasn't really a difference between the two cars in the first game anyway. Then again, the front cover of Rad Racer 2 shows a Formula 1 car driver even though there are no F1 cars in the game. That and having no vehicle choice makes the sequel have less options and could have potentially had the two cars with different attributes this time around, but we just have the good old red car. In terms of something new, there's now a boost mechanic when you're still by holding down on the D-pad and pressing A at the apex to instantly go full speed. This may sound cool, but getting a full charge takes several seconds and you're liable to run into something right away before you can react. Though the reason you may want to boost is that the car acceleration this time around is slower. Pressing up for the turbo like in the first game does help, but it can't be used until the car reaches around 80 km per hour, so those first 80 clicks are still going to be a drag. And honestly, between the boost powering up and the acceleration, it'll be slow to get the car going either way, making it even more frustrating when you crash. Speaking of crashes, in Rad Racer 2, all you do is spin out when you hit something, which is not as "whoa, holy shit" compared to the crash your car made in the first game. Granted, in that, the car is painfully repositioned back in the center unless it's already near there. That uses up several seconds and can usually cost the race. In Rad Racer 2, it thankfully doesn't do that, but the slow acceleration makes it just about as grating. The gameplay is mostly intact, but the driving in 2 is a bit different, and not in a good way. Steering isn't nearly as tight as the first game since your car veers off more during turns, making it looser and feel slippery. This, however, does make turning easier and maneuvering on lanes faster. In fact, it's possible to make the smaller turns and weave around traffic while going the full speed of 255 km per hour, when in the first game you pretty much had to use the brake to make any turn without crashing. So because of this, the game is easier than the first, but at the same time can be more frustrating, if that makes any sense. One reason being that running into other cars can cause you to spin out. Hitting cars in the first Rad Racer is something you obviously don't want to do, as they can cause you to slide off to the side and hit a pole or something. But for the most part that's all I did, only causing a crash if directly hitting cars in later courses. In Rad Racer 2, it's more common to crash directly into cars out of nowhere, and otherwise bumping into them just slows you down and not veer off to the side as much, which is pretty inconsistent in comparison. The obstacle of other cars has been changed a bit too. In the first game, the cars gradually got more difficult to pass, going from mild annoyances to jerks that lane change right in front of you, to by the time you're on the last stage, you want to murder every driver of every car in that course. With Rad Racer 2, the traffic is more subdued, with most of them staying in their spots and only occasionally changing lanes. But both games have what I call the asshole formation, when all 3 lanes are taken up by other cars, meaning you either have to wait till you pass one, or take a risk and weave your way through that often results in pinballing in between 2 cars, which happens more often in Rad Racer 2 due to looser driving. However, in order to make up for the lack of general assholes in Rad Racer 2, we have what I call the super assholes, red cars that do everything they can to block you and make you crash. I guarantee you'll hate these guys like I have. With a sequel on the NES, you expect the game to look better, but Rad Racer 2 only has slightly better graphics. The backgrounds and cars are more detailed, but the former takes up a bit more of the screen this time around and makes it slightly harder to see upcoming cars with less road in front of you sometimes. The sprite scaling in this is not as impressive with its lines to try and make it look faster and more 3D. Speaking of which, the sequel does not have a 3D glasses mode, but that's not really a big loss all things considering. But by the time this game came out, it doesn't seem to take much advantage of the NES's capabilities, and graphical effects like the sky changing colors in the predecessor aren't in this. Even the line to show the progress you made along the course if you run out of time just travels along as a short line instead of a complete one. Seriously, why? The interface, in case you couldn't tell, has been changed to look more like a car dashboard, with speed, turn warnings, stage progression, time remaining, and the boost meter all there. But one part of it that confuses me is the lap times in the lower left for each checkpoint. The races are not circuit, it's just drive to the goal. Why not just label these as sections or something instead? Was there only enough room on the screen for the word lap? Another thing that confused me was the music selection in the game. Similar to selecting music in Outrun, in Rad Racer you can play 3 different tunes while driving. The catch in that being you can turn on the songs and cycle through them on the fly by pressing down on the D-pad. You do have music selections in Rad Racer 2, yet it's somehow less than the first game, and you can't change or turn it off and on while racing since down is for the boost. Select is used to switch music tracks before the race, which there are only 2 songs and the one with no music called Sing Yourself. What, is the game basically telling me I should just sing instead? Well, if you say so. Da 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 da, driving a car, da 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 da, driving on a road made from tar, da 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 da, gotta go fast, and then make sure we're not in last, yeah, I'm not a good singer, I'm just gonna stop. Yeah, not only is the music selection a step down, but the sound design seems to have taken a downgrade too. When you have music playing while racing, you don't even hear the engine noise. Meanwhile, in the first game, you can still have the engine sound and the music, with the only sound cut being oncoming cars. That and the engine sound in 2 isn't even as good as the first. You basically can only choose between having music and the engine noise, though I prefer the music off in both games anyway. Not that the music in these games, which were both done by Nobuo Uematsu, is bad, it's just not all that necessary during the races, which is made even more apparent in the second game. The biggest disappointment in this game though are the levels. Not only are there only 8 courses like in the first game, but almost all the locations are near identical clones of Rad Racer 1's courses. First stage in Rad Racer, Sunset Coastline. In 2, Key West. Second stage in 1, San Francisco Highway. In the second game,
Big Apple,
Grand Canyon, Monument Valley, LA Nightway, Las Vegas, which both have giant square signs by the way, Snow White Line, Rocky Mountains. Wait, Snowy White Line as in... well, it was the 80s. Finally, Seaway and Typhoon, Gettysburg. Only the last 2 stages in Rad Racer 2 differ from ones, and the order of some stages do differ slightly, but it's overall still pretty unoriginal. Even the game over and continue system is the same. Normally if you lose a race, you start all over, but you can continue on the course you lost by holding A then start. It's understandable to do that in the first Rad Racer since it was an earlier NES game and some other games at the time did that too, but why couldn't you just have an on-screen continue option in 2? I know that's a bit of a nitpick, but did they just reuse the same programming code for the continue system? Although the games do have different endings, but to no surprise, the second game's ending is pretty generic with just a winding road and credits. And even though the first had no credits, it was still a cute little ending involving a guy and a girl with the car, whom you naturally don't see in the sequel. And I think that sums it up. Rad Racer 2 is one of the more lacking sequels I've played and doesn't add anything new that's worthwhile after the classic Rad Racer. The game just screams thrown out there for a quick American buck, and a month after this game came out, Final Fantasy would have been released here, almost as if this was insurance if Final Fantasy didn't sell that well for us. Needless to say, it wasn't as successful as the first Rad Racer since it was just a near-complete copy-paste game, with some tweaks actually making an already solid racing game not as solid. If it seems like I'm being too harsh on the game, it's only because for this particular review show, I'm focusing on comparing it with another game and as a follow-up. On its own, Rad Racer 2 is not that bad, but it's a rather pointless sequel that came out too little too late. Even so, Rad Racer itself is still fun, and it's thanks to these games and Outrun that other checkpoint racing games followed, such as Chase HQ, Cruisin' USA, and even a sequel of Outrun, just to name a few that I have. That and both Rad Racer games are inexpensive. I actually got my cartridge of Rad Racer 2 for $3 at a convention vendor. I just recommend getting Rad Racer for your NES racing game fix, unless for whatever reason you want to collect both games. Anyway, thanks for watching my debut of They Made a Sequel. Till then, I'll see you guys on the next Rad episode. Yeah, that was kinda lame. Still not as lame as Rad Racer 2, though.